Welcome back to Floxy's romance tale, where the alphas are dangerously possessive, the heroines are wickedly brilliant, and the chaos is absolutely spectacular. Quick question for my darlings before we dive into today's gorgeous disaster. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments and leave a little heart emoji if you're currently curled up somewhere cozy, pretending you're not completely obsessed with preternatural romance. Because honey, same. Today's story? Oh, it is everything. We have a razor-sharp, fiercely independent contract linguist with a color-coded planner and a deep, personal vendetta against the entire Lycan aristocracy. And then we have a king, a terrifying, magnetic, 6-foot-something king, who just kicked her hotel room door clean off its hinges. The sign said, "Do not disturb." He did not care. He is the disturbance. Reagan Calloway navigated her dependable, slightly road-worn navy blue compact SUV through the sweeping, meticulously maintained entrance of the Creston Grand Hotel in Asheville, North Carolina. The vehicle's modest engine hummed steadily beneath her, a grounded, practical contrast to the gleaming luxury sedans and ostentatious sports cars already crowding the valet roundabout. She eased into park, exhaled one slow, measured breath, and let the reality of the next 3 days settle over her like a wool coat, heavy, necessary, and vaguely suffocating. Her flawless warm brown skin caught the amber glow of the hotel's exterior lanterns. Her dark, expressive eyes were heavy from 18 hours of driving, but her professional composure was entirely immaculate. She adjusted the lapels of her deep forest green blazer, smoothing the structured fabric over her ivory blouse with practiced efficiency. From the passenger seat, she retrieved her high-capacity digital tablet and verified that the portable power bank, matte charcoal, military grade, was clipped firmly to its casing. Reagan had one non-negotiable fear in this life, and it was a dead battery at a geopolitical summit. Everything else she could manage. She tucked her favorite fountain pen, deep burgundy barrel, 18-karat gold nib, into the breast pocket of her blazer. Then she lifted the padded travel carrier from the back seat, unlatching the door to peer inside. Biscuit, her enormously round, spectacularly unimpressed orange tabby, stared back at her with the weary contempt of a cat who had been promised a peaceful afternoon and received a cross-state road trip instead. "I completely agree with you," Reagan murmured, her warm customer service cadence masking the exhaustion pooling behind her eyes. "The Blue Ridge Summit is a logistical nightmare, and the compensation should be criminal. But it's not, so here we are." Biscuit issued one long, resonant yowl of protest and began aggressively grooming his left ear. Reagan squared her shoulders and stepped out into the crisp mountain evening. Her signature fragrance, a heady, complex blend of black cherry and smoked amber, cut through the cool October air like a declaration. She handed her keys to a visibly startled valet and marched through the hotel's towering glass double doors. The lobby of the Creston Grand was an architectural flex of the highest order, soaring marble columns, cascading crystal chandeliers, and an enormous custom mosaic floor inlaid with the territorial crests of a dozen Lycan bloodlines. It was also, at this particular moment, a barely contained war zone. Near the grand staircase, 2 massive men were engaged in what polite society might call a heated discussion and what Reagan's trained eyes identified as a dominance display 3 seconds from going feral. Their broad frames were rigid with territorial aggression, their canines extended just enough to catch the chandelier light, and the marble floor was vibrating at a frequency that made the concierge's hands tremble. Reagan did not hesitate. She crossed the lobby in 12 measured strides, her heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm against the stone. She positioned herself precisely between the 2 alphas, raised her digital tablet like a shield, and deployed the smile, the one that looked genuinely delighted and felt like a warning shot. "Gentlemen," Reagan announced, her pitch bright and impeccably polished. "I'm Reagan Calloway, contracted geopolitical linguist for this summit. I couldn't help but notice you're conducting what appears to be a territorial dispute in the hotel reception area, and I want you to know I find that wonderfully ambitious." She tapped the tablet screen with one manicured finger. "Unfortunately, Article 14 of the Blue Ridge Accord mandates that all pre-summit territorial grievances be submitted via Form 7C in duplicate, notarized by a neutral diplomatic witness, and filed no later than 48 hours before opening ceremonies. You're currently 11 hours short of that window. She tilted her head. Should I email the form to your delegates, or would you prefer to stand here vibrating at each other until someone breaks a chandelier? The taller of the two alphas, a man built like a defensive lineman with the temperament of a thundercloud, snapped his gaze to her. His eyes flickered with genuine bewilderment. This is a matter of ancestral sovereignty, woman. You have no standing here. Reagan smiled wider. I have a notary stamp and a very long flight home. Do you want to test which one of us is more motivated? The sheer administrative audacity of it broke the tension like a pin through a balloon. Both alphas stared at her for a long, baffled moment, exchanged one final venomous look, and retreated in opposite directions without another word. Reagan exhaled through her nose, holstered her pen, and retrieved her room card from the deeply relieved front desk clerk. Suite 318, West Corridor, 3rd floor. She found the room with practiced efficiency, released Biscuit from his carrier, watched him immediately claim the velvet settee as sovereign territory, and set her tablet and power bank on the writing desk with the careful deliberateness of someone arranging a command center. She was running on fumes and spite, and both would carry her exactly as far as she needed. She opened her travel bag, pulled out a laminated placard she had printed at a FedEx office in Charlotte, thick cardstock, bold red lettering, and opened the door one final time. She looped the sign over the exterior brass handle. Do not disturb. She clicked the heavy deadbolt into place with a deeply satisfying thunk. Biscuit, already asleep, began to snore. Reagan was entirely unaware that 3 floors above her, a very dangerous man was tracking a rogue operative who had just vanished, and whose trail ended directly outside her wing. The suite was submerged in the kind of quiet that only arrives after a long, grueling drive, thick, merciful, and deeply earned. Reagan had exchanged her blazer and trousers for a floor-length silk robe in deep plum, and she stood at the bathroom vanity methodically removing her makeup, entirely prepared to surrender to 8 hours of unconsciousness. Biscuit's snoring from the settee formed the only soundtrack. Then the door exploded off its hinges. The sound was not dramatic in a cinematic way. It was immediate and visceral, a concussive boom of splintering wood and shearing metal that Reagan felt through the floor before she fully processed it. She set down her cleansing cloth, assessed the threat level in under 2 seconds, and walked out of the bathroom with the quiet, coiled composure of a woman who had once talked 2 rival pack elders out of a blood feud using nothing but a laminated clause reference sheet. The heavy oak door lay in fractured pieces on the Persian rug. The deadbolt mechanism dangled uselessly from the destroyed frame. And standing amid the wreckage, filling the entire doorway with the sheer architectural event of his presence, was a man. He was, and Reagan acknowledged this with the detached professionalism of a trauma surgeon noting vital signs, extraordinarily built. Tall, broad, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been designed by someone with a grudge against subtlety. He wore a charcoal blazer over a black shirt, and on his left wrist, a heavy titanium chronograph watch that cost more than Reagan's SUV, her rent, and her graduate school tuition combined. His dark hazel eyes swept the room with the rapid, tactical precision of someone who is looking for a threat and finding only a woman in a plum silk robe with a fountain pen and an expression of absolute, unimpressed displeasure. This, Reagan announced, her voice pleasantly professional in a way that was somehow more alarming than shouting, is a catastrophic violation of hospitality protocols. She walked to the writing desk, picked up her digital tablet, and pulled up a blank document. I'm Reagan Calloway, licensed geopolitical linguist. Who are you? Why are you in my room? And at what address shall I send the structural repair invoice? The man's mouth opened. Then it closed. It was possible, Reagan observed clinically, that he had not been spoken to like that in quite some time. Or possibly ever. He stepped into the room, and that was when it happened. Later, Reagan would describe the moment using the only language she trusted: technical, precise, emotionally neutral. What she experienced was a sudden, complete disruption of her neurological baseline. Like a tuning fork struck against bone. Her preternatural omega instincts, which she kept aggressively leashed at all times, surged forward with an immediacy that bordered on embarrassing. She ignored them. She was excellent at ignoring them. "There's a security breach on this floor," the man said. His voice was low, the kind of register that lived in your sternum after you heard it. "I'm the summit's head of security. I was tracking a rogue operative." "The only breach I'm currently observing," Reagan replied, pointing to the wreckage of her door with her pen, "is the one you created. I had a do not disturb sign." She pulled up a new screen on her tablet and turned it toward him. "This is a preliminary invoice. Structural door replacement, hardware, installation labor, and a flat-rate distress fee for the interruption of a mandatory rest cycle. I accept digital transfers." The man stared at the screen. Then, slowly, a smirk curved one corner of his mouth, the kind of expression that looked like it didn't get much practice. "Damien Cole," he said, by way of introduction. His dark hazel eyes had not moved from her face. "Mr. Cole." Reagan tilted her chin. "Are you going to pay this, or should I file directly with the Territorial Council?" "I'll pay it," Damien said, still watching her with an intensity that Reagan absolutely refused to find affecting. "But I'll need a receipt." She looked at him for exactly one beat. Obviously. The gaping hole where Reagan's door used to be let in a steady draft from the corridor, and Reagan addressed this by retrieving a cashmere throw from the closet and wrapping it around her shoulders like a statement of intent. She was not going to let the cold, the structural devastation, or the alarmingly magnetic presence of the man currently standing in her living space derail her. Damien Cole had not left. He stood near the entrance, one hand in his pocket, watching her with that dark, calculating stillness that made her preternatural instincts do things she was firmly not acknowledging. "I was truthful about the security breach," Damien said, and there was something careful in his voice now, something that hadn't been there before. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and removed a folded piece of parchment. It was old and stained, the edges brown, and the surface covered in angular, unfamiliar runes. "This was intercepted from an operative on this floor 30 minutes ago. My linguistics team cannot identify the dialect. You're listed as the premier preternatural linguist on the continent." Reagan did not move toward it. "I'm off the clock." "I'm aware." Damien held a parchment with a steadiness that suggested he was accustomed to holding dangerous things. "This cannot wait for office hours." "Then it should have made an appointment." Reagan crossed her arms. "The Lycan aristocracy has a documented, well-evidenced history of using rushed translations to manufacture legal cover for territorial violence. I don't do expedited work for entities I don't trust. And I definitely don't do it at midnight with no door." Biscuit chose this moment to emerge from the bedroom, assess the situation, and waddle directly to Damien Cole's feet. He sat down and stared up at the man with enormous, unblinking yellow eyes. Damien looked down at the cat. The cat looked up at him. "He hates everyone," Reagan said flatly. "Don't read into it." Biscuit headbutted Damien's ankle. Reagan pressed her lips together. "Name your after-hours rate," Damien said, dragging his gaze back up to hers. "Emergency consultation. Whatever number makes this acceptable to you." Reagan pulled a figure from the vault of astronomically offensive numbers she kept for exactly these situations, a sum so egregious it would insult even the most flush security budget, and send him quietly toward the door. She stated it with a pleasant smile and a challenging tilt of her chin. Damien did not blink. He retrieved his phone, thumbed through a biometric interface, and completed a wire transfer in the time it took Reagan to realize what was happening. "Done," he said, pocketing the device. "You're retained for the evening, Miss Calloway." Reagan stared at him for a long, recalibrating moment. "No security chief has liquid access to that figure," she said slowly, her dark eyes narrowing with a focused precision she usually reserved for syntactic anomalies in 3-century-old documents. "Not without a multi-tier committee approval." Damien extended the parchment toward her. "Shall we examine the dialect?" Reagan looked at the parchment, then at him. Then, because she had been raised practical, and because the transfer had already cleared, she took it. "You have 30 minutes, she said. "And I'm putting this on the invoice." Reagan was not going to translate classified documents in a drafty room with debris on the carpet. She established this fact by pushing the broken door fragments into a tidy pile with her foot, activating the suite's gas fireplace with the precision of someone who appreciated a reliable ignition source, and sitting on the velvet settee with her tablet, her power bank, her pen, and the professionalism of a woman getting paid extremely well to be awake after midnight. Damien settled beside her on the settee. Not in the armchair. Not at a respectful distance. Beside her, close enough that the heat of his presence competed with the fireplace. "You could sit there," Reagan said pleasantly, indicating the armchair with her pen. "I can read over your shoulder better from here," Damien replied. "You can also read fine from 3 feet away." He did not move. Reagan exhaled through her nose and directed her full attention to the parchment, holding it by its corners and using her pen as a pointer. "This isn't standard high Lycan," she murmured, and the moment professional analysis engaged, her social discomfort receded to a manageable background frequency. "The base structure is Northern Ridge dialect, but it's been scrambled. There's a substitution cipher layered over it. They've replaced every 5th glyph with a phonetic stand-in from a completely different regional syntax. It was designed to look like a routine trade manifest." "What does it actually say?" Damien asked, and she felt the low resonance of his voice in a way she was categorically ignoring. "It's a logistics manifest." Reagan pulled up her comparative translation matrix, her fingers moving quickly across the interface. Movement of unregistered weapons into the hotel sublevels. Delivery timetables. Access codes. She paused, her eyes tracing a cluster of glyphs in the lower quadrant. "This isn't a single assassination, Mr. Cole. It's coordinated. Multiple targets. Tomorrow's assembly." Damien went still in the precise, predatory way that animals went still before something decisive. And then Biscuit destroyed the moment entirely. The enormous tabby launched himself from the bedroom doorway, crossed the room in a series of ungainly bounds, and landed squarely in the center of Reagan's digital tablet. His back paws hit 3 different function keys simultaneously. The translation matrix minimized. A calendar app opened. An error notification bloomed in aggressive red across the screen. "Biscuit? Absolutely not." Reagan reached for the tablet, but the cat had already pivoted and, with the calculated indifference of a true chaos agent, stepped directly into Damien's lap and began kneading the fabric of his trousers. There was a silence. Damien looked down at the 14-pound tabby currently destroying his slacks with rhythmic, enthusiastic paws. "He is a terrible judge of character," Reagan said, recovering the tablet and desperately restoring her files. "I apologize. He has never done this with a Lycan before." "He seems comfortable," Damien said, and there was genuine amusement in his voice, low and quiet, like it didn't get used often. His large hand settled carefully on Biscuit's back, and the cat responded by increasing his purring to an unreasonable volume. Reagan fixed the error, recovered the matrix, and absolutely did not notice how carefully the allegedly dangerous head of Summit Security was petting her cat. "The translation confirms a staging operation in the hotel's lowest sublevel," she said, keeping her voice clinical. "The strike is planned for tomorrow morning, during the opening assembly." Damien's amusement faded. "Then we have 6 hours. "Yes," Reagan agreed. "Which is why I need you to move to the armchair, so I can think clearly." He looked at her. She looked at the tablet. Neither of them moved for a full 3 seconds. "The armchair," Reagan repeated firmly. He moved. But he took Biscuit with him, and the cat went willingly, which Reagan decided she was simply not going to process right now. Dawn arrived with the aggressive cheerfulness of mountain light through uncurtained windows, and Reagan greeted it already dressed in a tailored deep plum pantsuit, her hair gathered into a precise low bun, her tablet charged, her pen in her pocket, and her professional armor fully assembled. The parchment translation had taken until 4 in the morning. She had confirmed the target list, the timing, and most critically, the identity of the shell corporation funding the operation. She had documented everything in triplicate, saved it to 3 separate cloud locations, and printed a physical backup from the small travel printer she kept in her luggage specifically because cloud storage was not a thing she fully trusted. Damien had left around 3 with a translated summary and a promise to dispatch his security detail to the hotel's lower levels before dawn. He had paused at the threshold, or rather, at the gaping absence of a threshold where her door used to be, and looked back at her with those dark hazel eyes in a way that she was currently categorizing as professionally irrelevant and moving on. She descended to the lobby at 7, intent on finding espresso strong enough to constitute a medical intervention. She was intercepted before she made it 12 feet past the elevator bank. The man who stepped into her path was Lord Prescott Aldrich. She recognized him from the pre-summit credentials she'd reviewed, a Lycan delegate from the Western Coalition, built like a filing cabinet, and carrying the particular brand of arrogance that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. Miss Calloway. Aldrich's smile was the kind that didn't involve the eyes. I've heard you spent last night translating some rather sensitive materials. Those archives belong to the Territorial Council. You'll hand over your tablet. Reagan assessed him the way she assessed all obstacles, quickly, dispassionately, and with an eye toward the most efficient resolution. Her Omega instincts flickered, not with fear, but with the low, precise alertness of a woman who had been underestimated by men exactly like this her entire professional career. "Good morning, Lord Aldrich," she said, deploying her warmest, most professionally bottomless smile. "I want to acknowledge what an interesting choice it was to attempt to intimidate a contracted specialist before she's had coffee. Genuinely admirable commitment to the bit." She raised her tablet. "Any materials in my possession were obtained and processed under the terms of my professional contract, which is governed by Article 7 of the Blue Ridge Summit Confidentiality Mandate. You don't have the authority to confiscate them. If you'd like to file a grievance, I'll send you the form." Aldrich's smile dropped. His canines extended exactly enough to make the threat legible. "You're a contract worker," he said, dropping his voice low. "You have no standing in this room. I have a notary stamp, a direct line to the Territorial Oversight Board, and absolutely no patience this morning." Reagan tilted her head. "Would you like to reconsider?" He didn't. He reached for the tablet. He didn't get there. The temperature in the lobby dropped about 15 degrees in an instant. Damien Cole materialized from the corridor to her right with the fluid, soundless efficiency of a very large man who had practiced moving without being heard. His hand landed on Aldrich's wrist, not violent, just precise, and applied exactly enough pressure to make the man's knees buckle. "She asked you to step aside," Damien said, his voice barely above conversational volume, which was somehow worse than shouting. "I'd recommend doing that." Aldrich went from threatening to terrified in under 2 seconds. Damien released him, and the delegate retreated across the lobby without a single word of protest, straightening his jacket as he went. Reagan watched him go. Then she turned to Damien, who had moved to stand beside her with the easy, instinctive positioning of someone placing himself between her and the room. "That was unnecessary," she said, though she noted clinically that her heart rate had done something she was not going to analyze. "I had it." "You did," Damien agreed. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention that she kept telling herself was tactical rather than personal. "I know." Reagan studied him for one long moment. Aldrich had been a senior delegate. The way Damien had neutralized him, no hesitation, zero concern about the political fallout, did not align with the operational profile of a summit security contractor. "You're very well resourced for an enforcer," she said. Damien met her eyes and said nothing. Reagan tucked that observation into the growing file she was building in the back of her mind and went to find her espresso. By mid-afternoon, Reagan had a new door, reinforced oak, upgraded deadbolt, installed by what appeared to be an extremely well-funded carpentry crew that arrived within the hour of her submitting the formal request. The speed of the turnaround was suspicious. She noted it. She had also, in the quiet hours, made an additional discovery. While cross-referencing the parchment cipher against the hotel's master booking logs, she'd identified something Damien's security team had missed entirely. They'd been scanning for preternatural signatures and encrypted communications. Reagan had looked for something far more mundane, accounting irregularities. The rogue faction hadn't infiltrated the hotel. They'd purchased access to it. A shell corporation called Bastion Meridian LLC had paid a premium booking fee to secure exclusive use of sublevel B, the parking structure level directly beneath the main assembly hall, with a contract clause that waived the standard inspection protocol. It was a bureaucratic exploit so boring and so brilliant that no magical audit would have caught it. Reagan was halfway through documenting her findings when a sharp, authoritative knock sounded at her new door. She opened it 3 inches, maintaining the chain. Damien filled the frame. He always seemed to fill whatever frame he was in. "The lobby is secure," he said. "I need to review the overnight translation progress." Reagan studied him through the gap. "You could email me. I'm here now." She unlatched the chain, opened the door, and held out her tablet before he could step fully inside. "Before you breach my structural perimeter a second time," she said pleasantly, "you need to complete this." Damien looked at the document displayed on her screen. It was titled, Form 2B, Temporary Suite Access Protocol and Non-Destruction Agreement. A slow, involuntary sound escaped him, somewhere between disbelief and genuine laughter. "You cannot be serious. It waives your right to kick in my door again, mandates a minimum 3-foot distance from my equipment, and formally acknowledges that Biscuit retains sovereign authority over the velvet settee." Reagan extended her pen. "Sign it or brief me from the hallway." Damien looked at the form, then at her. Then he took the pen, scrawled something on the signature line that may or may not have been a real signature, and handed it back. "Documented," he said. "Appreciated," she replied, and stepped back to let him in. He moved through the suite with that unsettling, contained energy, aware of every exit, cataloging every corner, and yet somehow managing to look comfortable. He settled on the settee. Biscuit emerged from the bedroom, assessed the situation, and immediately colonized Damien's left leg. "He's consistent," Reagan said. "He has good instincts," Damien replied. Reagan opened her tablet and turned the screen toward him. "I found the staging ground. Your team was looking for magic. The exploit is corporate." She walked him through the Bastion Meridian discovery, the sublevel booking, the inspection waiver, the financial routing. She watched his face as the scope of it registered. They were already inside. Damien said, the words measured, controlled. Before we locked anything down, they had already paid for unrestricted access. "Yes." Reagan set the tablet on the coffee table. "Your enforcers need to clear sublevel B before the morning assembly. All of it." Damien was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her the way people looked at things they were trying to memorize. "You found what an entire intelligence network missed," he said, using a spreadsheet. "Administrative forensics," Reagan said mildly. "People underestimate boring paperwork. They shouldn't." Damien leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for a moment the carefully maintained distance between them compressed. "You're remarkable," he said, and it wasn't a line. It was stated with the same flat certainty he'd used to tell her the lobby was secure, as though it was simply a fact he'd catalogued. Reagan looked at the fire rather than at him. "I'm going to pretend you said efficient. I said what I said." She cleared her throat and closed the tablet. "Dispatch your team to sublevel B tonight. The summit's opening should be safe by morning." "I'll handle it," Damien said. He stood, and for a moment he was very close. "No one comes through that door tonight, Reagan." She registered the deliberate use of her first name and categorized it under Do Not Acknowledge. "Thank you," she said, which was possibly the first time she'd said those 2 words to someone like him without attaching a form reference. The formal summit gala opened on the second evening in the Creston Grand's celebrated obsidian ballroom. All black granite walls, cascading gold light fixtures, and the particular charged electricity of several dozen apex predators dressed in formal wear and pretending to be civilized. Reagan had exchanged her working blazer for a gown the color of deep garnet, structured silk, elegant in its clean lines, dramatic in the way quality things are dramatic without trying. She'd twisted her hair up in a sleek knot and allowed herself one piece of jewelry, a thin gold bracelet, her mother's. She'd packed her tablet and power bank into a structured black clutch because Reagan Calloway did not go anywhere without her equipment. Formal event be damned. She was 3 minutes from securing a sparkling water and a corner to observe from when Lord Aldrich's second-in-command, a delegate named Harmon Vesper, younger, better dressed, and equally overconfident, materialized at her left elbow. Miss Calloway. Vesper's smile was practiced, polished, and completely hollow. You look stunning. I insist you join me for the opening dance. I insist you consult your summit etiquette packet, Reagan replied pleasantly. Contracted specialists are prohibited from participating in social programming with active delegates. It's in the footnotes. I can send you a copy. Vesper laughed like she'd made a charming joke. Surely just one dance. He reached for her elbow. The room temperature dropped. Damien stepped out of the architectural shadow of a nearby column with a quiet, inexorable momentum of weather. He was in a black tuxedo, the titanium watch glinting at his wrist, his dark hazel eyes fixed on Vesper with an expression that communicated a clear hierarchy of priorities and Vesper standing in it. She declined, Damien said. Vesper went very still in the way prey animals went still. He looked between Reagan and Damien, reassessed the situation with visible urgency, and excused himself in the direction of the bar. You keep doing that, Reagan said, careful to keep her voice even. He was encroaching, Damien said simply. I can handle encroachment. I do it professionally. But her voice was a little less firm than usual, and she knew it. Damien stepped closer, and the crowd around them seemed to naturally recede. We need to talk privately, he said, dropping his voice. Not here. Too many surveillance lines. If you say, come with me, I'm going to need you to appreciate the irony of that request. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but its very near neighbor. Please come with me, Miss Calloway. Reagan sighed like a woman who had made a series of inexplicably reasonable decisions that had all individually been fine, and yet collectively landed her somewhere complicated. Lead the way. The room Damien brought her to was a long, narrow cloakroom off the secondary corridor, velvet-lined racks of cashmere overcoats and heavy winter cloaks, muffled acoustic insulation, a single low lamp casting amber across the deep-colored fabrics. The heavy door swung shut behind them, and the ballroom's noise became a distant, polite murmur. Reagan set her clutch on a nearby shelf, extracted her tablet, because she was going to need to look at something that wasn't Damien's face, and adopted her most professionally armored stance. What's the security concern? Damien stood close. Not invasively close, but in that particular way he had of reducing the available air in a room simply by being in it. The Bastion Meridian arrests went smoothly. The sublevel cache was neutralized before midnight. He paused. But one of the operatives talked before we transferred him. He named a council member as an inside contact. Reagan absorbed that. Which means tomorrow's assembly has a leak at the leadership level. Yes. Damien's gaze was steady on hers. I need to know if there's a secondary cipher layer in the parchment. Something your initial translation might have missed. A second set of instructions buried in the syntax. Reagan considered this. It's possible. The Northern Ridge dialect has a layered structure that can support nested meaning if you know the indexing sequence. She pulled up the saved translation files on her tablet. If there's a second layer, it would be embedded in every third syllable of the outer cipher. She began tracing the sequence with her pen, and her professional focus ignited with the particular clean heat of a genuinely interesting problem. Damien leaned in to look at the screen. His shoulder was against hers. He smelled like pine and something darker, something that her preternatural instincts insisted on cataloging despite explicit instructions not to. Here, Reagan said, her pen pausing over a cluster of glyphs. This sequence doesn't resolve cleanly in the outer cipher. It's a residual, the ghost of a deeper layer. She began the index extraction. Give me 20 minutes. She worked in silence. Damien watched, not the tablet, but her, in the peripheral way she was determined not to acknowledge. Biscuit was not here to create a blessed distraction. 12 minutes later, the secondary layer resolved. It's a name, Reagan said quietly. Her voice had changed register. That hollow, careful note that meant the information mattered more than she wanted it to. The council contact isn't a delegate. It's a member of the Royal Administrative Corps. She looked up. Someone with direct access to the King's security protocols. Damien's jaw hardened. He pulled out his phone and issued 3 rapid, quiet directives. Then he looked back at her, and there was something raw in his expression beneath the composure, something that looked like it cost him effort to contain. "That information could have gotten you killed," he said. "Most genuinely useful information could," Reagan replied. "I'm not going to let that happen." Reagan studied him carefully. She was very good at reading people. It was the bedrock of her professional practice, and what she read in Damien Cole right now was not the controlled effect of a security contractor doing a job. It was something more fundamental than that and more alarming. "You're exceptional at your work," she said carefully. "But you are not my head of security, Mr. Cole. You're not responsible for me." He held her gaze and said nothing, which was somehow worse than any argument. Reagan had not made it back to her suite with her composure entirely intact. She'd managed it outwardly, perfectly maintained, professionally sealed, but something had shifted in the architecture of her certainty, and she was aware of it the way you're aware of a hairline fracture in load-bearing concrete. She sat on the velvet settee with her tablet, Biscuit warm against her hip, the gas fireplace doing its reliable, mechanical thing. She was reviewing the secondary cipher extraction, running cross-checks, being productive. She was also noticing that the titanium chronograph watch Damien wore was not available for retail purchase. She'd looked. It was a custom commission. An item of that caliber meant funds that did not exist on any security contractor's payroll, regardless of discretionary budgeting. She made a note in a separate document titled, "Inconsistencies D. Cole." The list was growing. At 11 p.m., Damien knocked. The proper, contained knock she'd specified in Form 2B, which he appeared to have actually read, and she let him in. He settled in the armchair rather than the settee, which she appreciated. Biscuit relocated to his lap with zero ceremony. "The council member has been detained," Damien said. "The summit is secure for tomorrow." "Good." Reagan looked at him over her tablet. "I've been updating the secondary cipher analysis. There's one more cluster I want to verify before morning." Damien nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had a texture to it, something it was carrying that hadn't been there before. "When you talked about the aristocracy earlier," he said carefully, "you mentioned personal experience. What happened?" Reagan's pen stopped moving.
She had a policy about this.
She did not share it professionally. She had learned through specific, costly experience that describing the systematic legal destruction of your family to representatives of the institutions that benefited from it was not a path toward justice. It was just a path toward being dismissed with polite condolences. But it was very late, and the fire was making that room the particular kind of warm that eroded policy, and she was exhausted in a way that went all the way down. 15 years ago, she said, and her voice was even because she had practiced keeping it even, my family ran an independent logistics operation. Preternatural trade routes across the Mid-Atlantic corridor. We were small, successful, completely outside the aristocratic hierarchy. We liked it that way. Damien was very still. The Montgomery pack, a noble bloodline, wanted our corridor access. They drafted a territorial agreement. My father signed it. She set her pen down. The royal scribe had used a Northern Ridge dialect phrase in the High Lycan text. A single-syllable substitution. It shifted the document from a shared access agreement to a full territorial transfer.
She paused.
The guard came 6 days later. My father tried to contest it. They had a signed document. They used it. The fire made its soft mechanical sounds. I was 17. I survived because my aunt drove me out before dawn. She picked up her pen again and tapped it against the tablet casing in the precise, grounding rhythm she developed as a teenager. I spent the next 10 years learning every dialect, every cipher, every archaic legal loophole in the preternatural lexicon, so that no one could ever do to someone else what they did to my family by exploiting a single misread syllable. The suite was completely silent. Damien's expression had traveled somewhere difficult. His hands, usually composed, were still, and there was a quality in his stillness that was different from his usual controlled composure. This was the stillness of someone sitting with something very heavy. The Montgomery Pack's authorization, he said carefully, would have required a royal seal. It did, Reagan said. I've seen the document. It had the sovereign crest. The king at the time, whatever his name was, either signed off on it or his administration did. It amounts to the same thing. She looked at the fire. That's why I don't work for the nobility. That's why I charge what I charge, and file what I file, and make them sign Form 2B. Because paperwork is the only thing they can't just kick out of the way. Damien reached across the space between them and placed his hand over hers. It was not a calculated gesture. It was just what he did, and it was so simple and so steady that Reagan's carefully maintained equilibrium took a direct hit. I promise you, he said, and his voice had that fundamental, anchoring quality that she kept refusing to trust because she couldn't afford to. The people responsible for that will not retain what they took. She looked at him. She couldn't read his expression, which almost never happened to her, but she could feel the absolute weight of the vow. You're a contractor, she said quietly. It's not yours to promise. Damien said nothing, but something in his eyes told her the statement was more complicated than it sounded. The second morning of the summit dawned sharp and clear, the mountain light hard and bright through Reagan's windows. She had slept 3 hours, processed what she could, and emerged dressed in a structured charcoal blazer and wide-leg trousers that said I run things in the universal language of well-tailored fabric. The assembly hall was full by 9. Delegates from 7 territorial coalitions, a collection of old money bloodlines, and the full Blue Ridge Administrative Corps filled the tiered seating. Reagan had a working position at the translator's table and a direct feed to the proceedings. Damien was seated at the security perimeter, which was where she had decided to look exactly once, and then not again. The assembly opened with a territorial review. Reagan translated in real time, flagging a moderately concerning phrasing in one delegate's proposed boundary amendment and efficiently redirecting it through proper channels before it became a diplomatic incident. She knew, very good at this. The work was clean and satisfying in the way that complex problems always were when you had the tools to solve them. Then Lord Aldrich stood to speak. Reagan kept her expression perfectly neutral. Her fingers hovered over her tablet. Aldrich's proposal was smooth, well-rehearsed, and embedded. She caught it immediately, with a phonetic shift borrowed directly from the cipher she'd translated 48 hours earlier. It was subtle. It was in the legal clause he was submitting for the council's signature. A single redirected syllable that would transform a resource-sharing agreement for 3 working-class packs into a forced territorial transfer. Reagan set down her pen. She stood up. Point of linguistic order, she said, her voice carrying cleanly through the assembly's built-in acoustics with a clarity that silenced the room. She walked to the central floor without being invited, opened her tablet, and displayed the phonetic deviation on the main screen. Lord Aldrich's proposed clause contains an unlicensed dialect modification in subsection 4C. When correctly parsed, the redistributive language reads as an involuntary cession rather than a cooperative agreement. I'd like to request a full linguistic review before any signature is obtained. The silence in the room was the particular quality of silence that follows something politically catastrophic being said out loud in public. Aldrich's face went through several complicated transitions. Several of the working-class PAC representatives looked at Reagan with an expression she recognized, the exact look her father had worn on the day she'd told him there was something wrong with the treaty, years too late. She had made it in time. The council thanks the contracted linguist for her review, the summit chair said, recovering, and will table the clause for independent analysis. Reagan returned to her seat. She set her pen down precisely parallel to the tablet's edge. Her hands were steady. She did not look at Damien, but she was aware, with the peripheral acuity she'd spent years developing, that he was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that looked, unmistakably, like awe. The afternoon recess gave Reagan 40 minutes, a corner table in the hotel's cafe, and something approaching a real meal. She was working through a chicken sandwich and 40 pages of secondary dialect review when Damien appeared, set a cup of espresso on the table without asking, and sat down across from her. That was, he began.
Necessary, she said.
Procedurally unremarkable. You just reversed an active exploitation attempt in front of 7 territorial coalitions using a linguistic argument. I did my job. She picked up the espresso. It was exactly how she took it, and she decided not to think about how he'd known that. The clause will be reviewed. The working-class packs will retain their resource rights. She set the cup down. It won't undo everything the aristocracy has done, but it's one thing. Damien was watching her with that quality of attention that had been making her increasingly difficult to categorize. He reached into his jacket. I have something for you. He set a long, slim velvet box on the table between them. Reagan looked at it. What is this? Open it. She did, because she was constitutionally unable to resist an unknown quantity. Inside, resting on dark satin, was a fountain pen. Not the kind of pen you bought. The kind that got made. Heavy, custom-balanced, crafted from a material that caught the light with an unambiguous, weighty luster. Reagan lifted it. She knew materials. She knew metals. She turned the pen over in her hands, and her stomach did something cold and careful. It was titanium. Not plated. Not alloyed. Solid titanium, custom-milled, with archaic Lycan runes etched along the barrel in microscopic, flawless detail. The nib was a custom grind. An item like this required access to a Royal Metallurgy Commission. She set it down on the velvet box. She looked at Damien's wrist. At the titanium chronograph watch she'd looked up and found could only be acquired through a Royal Commission house. She looked back at the pen. A security contractor, Reagan said, her voice very even, cannot access a Royal Metallurgy Commission. Damien did not look away. The overnight transfer you authorized, she continued, cleared a figure that bypasses standard banking oversight, the kind of bypass that requires a sovereign-level financial credential. Her pen, the old one, the burgundy-barreled one, tapped against the table. You knew Lord Aldrich would back down from you before he saw you move. That's not enforcer authority. That's recognized hierarchy. Damien said nothing, and in his silence was the answer she didn't want. Who are you? Reagan said, not quite a question anymore. The cafe was quiet around them. The espresso steamed. My name, Damien said slowly, is Damien Cole Ashford. He paused. I'm the Lycan King. The words settled over Reagan like cold water. She stood up from the table, her movements precise and contained, picked up her old pen, left the velvet box, and walked away from him without saying another word. Reagan did not go to her room. She went to the translation archive on the mezzanine level, because the archive had no windows that faced the direction of the cafe, and because paperwork was the only reliable emotional regulation tool she had. She sat at a workstation and opened her tablet and looked at the screen and did not read anything on it for approximately 6 minutes. Then she pulled up the records she'd filed 3 hours after arriving at the Creston Grand, the ones she always kept for every summit because she was thorough. The Blue Ridge Summit organizational roster, the commission funding sources, the security credentialing chain. She ran a cross-reference on the name Cole Ashford against the Sovereign Royal Registry. The result was immediate and unambiguous. King Damien Cole Ashford ascended the throne 15 years ago following the forced removal of the corrupt Montgomery administration, had spent the intervening decades systematically restructuring the aristocratic council, dissolving legacy exploitation clauses, and establishing a working-class territorial protection mandate that had been, she read this part twice, specifically designed to prevent the category of legal manipulation used in the Montgomery-era territorial seizures. Reagan sat with this for a long moment. The sovereign seal on her family's transfer document had belonged to the Montgomery administration, not to Damien Cole Ashford. She knew this. She had always known the timeline. She'd been too angry for too long to look at it clearly. She closed the registry. She sat very still. A sharp, distinctive knock sounded at the archive door, the contained, specific pattern from Form 2B, which she had not expected him to remember. I know you're in there, Damien said from the other side of the door. I can smell the black cherry. Reagan got up and opened the door. He was in the corridor, no tuxedo jacket, looking like a man who had been sitting with something difficult for the past 40 minutes and was done with the pretense of patience. You lied to me, she said. I withheld my title, he said. I didn't lie about anything that mattered. That is the most aristocratic sentence I have ever heard. Something crossed his face, something honest and not particularly comfortable. If I had walked through your door and said, "I'm the Lycan King," you would have called security, filed a restraining clause, and driven your Navy SUV back to wherever you came from before I could explain a single thing. Reagan looked at him for a long time. The archive was quiet around them. What would you have explained? Damien met her eyes. That the Montgomery administration destroyed your family. That I spent 15 years dismantling every institutional structure that made that possible. That when I walked into Suite 318 and your preternatural signature hit me like, he stopped. Started again. I knew who you were within 30 seconds. Not your name. What you were to me. He said this with the same flat, careful certainty he used for everything. I should have told you. I didn't because I was afraid you'd leave before I could prove anything. Reagan said nothing. You were right to be angry, Damien said. You're allowed to stay angry. I'm not asking you to trust a king. I'm asking you to give me a week to show you what I've built. Reagan looked at the floor. Then the wall. Then him. You broke my door, she said. I'll buy you a new one. I already made you pay for it. That's not the point. She exhaled. You have a royal metallurgist. You have titanium commissions and a sovereign financial credential, and you have been sitting in my suite watching me feed your translated intelligence to your security team while pretending to be a functionary. Yes. That was, objectively, an extraordinarily manipulative thing to do. Yes. No qualification. No defense. Just the admission, flat and honest and not going anywhere. Reagan looked at the velvet box she'd left on the cafe table, which was gone. She noticed his inside jacket pocket had a familiar shape to it. You kept it, she said. You left it. I'm returning it when you'll accept it. She studied him for one long, measuring moment. She was very good at reading people, and what she was reading right now was not comfortable for her, because it was straightforward, and it was real, and it was exactly the kind of thing she'd spent 15 years convincing herself she didn't need. 1 week, she said. And you're enrolling in an HR seminar. Damien blinked. I'm sorry? Your conflict resolution methodology involves bone fractures. That's a liability. She walked back to her workstation. I'll send you the schedule. They spent the remaining summit hours working. Not around each other, with each other, in the way that required a kind of trust Reagan hadn't offered anyone in a long time and was apparently offering now, which she was simply going to acknowledge and move forward from. Damien had her consultation elevated from the translator's table to the main council floor. She caught 2 more dialect exploits before midday. He dismantled a territorial funding scheme that 3 senior delegates had been running for a decade, using the financial forensics she'd outlined as the framework. On the final morning, he stood at the head of the assembly and issued 3 royal decrees. The first dissolved the archaic territorial acquisition clause in its entirety. The second retroactively annulled every conveyance executed under the Montgomery-era phonetic shift loophole, including, and he read the case number clearly into the assembly record, the Mid-Atlantic Corridor transfer that had displaced the Calloway logistics operation 15 years prior. The third directed the full restoration of seized assets, territories, and financial holdings to the surviving heir. Reagan sat at the council table and listened to her family's name spoken aloud in the official record for the first time in 15 years, and she kept her expression professionally neutral until the session broke, and then she walked out to the corridor and sat on a marble bench and breathed very carefully for about 3 minutes. Damien found her there. He sat beside her and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. After a while, Reagan said, "That was more than a week's worth of proof." "I had a deadline," Damien said. She looked at the pen in her inner jacket pocket. She could see the shape of it through the fabric. "I'll take it now," she said. "If the offer still stands." He reached into his jacket and held it out. She took it. It was heavy and perfectly balanced, and she spent approximately 30 seconds allowing herself to feel what she felt about that before she put it in her pocket and stood up and said, "The HR seminar still applies." "Obviously," said Damien, with the tone of a man who had fully committed to this. The West Wing office of the new Continental Preternatural Affairs Bureau occupied what had previously been a ceremonial receiving room. all high ceilings and tall windows, and an unforgiving amount of marble, and Reagan had transformed it with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting 15 years to have a room she could organize exactly the way she wanted. The desk was mahogany, enormous, and covered in a highly deliberate arrangement of filing systems that would have been indecipherable to anyone else and were perfectly legible to her. The digital tablet and its charcoal power bank occupied a permanent charging station. The titanium pen lived in a custom stand beside a photograph of her and Biscuit that had appeared on the desk one morning without explanation. The bureau had been Damien's framework and her architecture. She had spent 3 months drafting the linguistic oversight mandate that made it operational, a legal structure so comprehensive and deliberately unambiguous that it had passed the full council with 0 successful amendments. She had then spent another 2 months auditing every territorial treaty executed in the previous 2 decades and flagging 17 additional exploits for review. Lord Aldrich had personally delivered his financial disclosures a week early. He had been sweating. On this particular afternoon, Biscuit was asleep on the window ledge, radiating regal disapproval at the city below. The gas fireplace, because Reagan had insisted on one and gotten it, maintained its consistent blue and orange output in the corner. The heavy oak door opened. Damien walked in the way he always walked in now, not filling the room with volatile contained energy but with something more settled, a presence that was still formidable but no longer anxious about being. He carried a stack of quarterly compliance ledgers and Biscuit's afternoon treat because he had absorbed the cat's schedule with a focused commitment he applied to all important things. Harmon Vesper submitted his documentation, he said, setting the ledgers on the corner of her desk. He put the treat on the window ledge. Biscuit accepted it without acknowledgement. He included a personal apology note. 3 paragraphs. That's excessive, Reagan said, not looking up from her current file. 2 paragraphs is the professional standard for documented misconduct. I'll tell him. Damien rounded the desk, the familiar ease of that movement still doing something in her chest that she had stopped trying to categorize. He stood beside her chair, looking at the screen she was working from. You caught another one, he said. Naturally. She pointed to a clause in a Northern Ridge boundary agreement. They keep trying variations of the same phonetic trick. It's almost flattering. Almost. She saved the file and leaned back in her chair, looking up at him. He was watching her in the way he did, with the full, particular attention of someone who never felt the need to look anywhere else. I have your HR seminar evaluation, she said. 6 months of remediation. Damien's expression achieved something that had once been a smirk and had evolved over time into something warmer and more genuine. What's my grade? Reagan opened a new file on her tablet and turned the screen toward him. It was labeled Form 9F, Remediation Outcome Assessment, D. Cole Ashford, Sovereign Level. Across the top, in the evaluation field, she had written, *satisfactory progress. Bone fractures reduced by approximately 70%. Paperwork completion. Exceptional. Recommend ongoing monitoring. *. Damien read it. Ongoing monitoring. Indefinitely, Reagan said. You're a long-term project. He reached out, took the titanium pen from its stand, and set it in her hand, then wrapped both his hands around hers in the way that was always steady, always there, the way she had stopped being surprised by and started simply trusting, which was its own kind of miracle. I will gladly submit to indefinite monitoring, Damien said, his voice that low, grounded register she'd long since stopped cataloging as threat and had recatalogued as home, provided the supervisor is you. Reagan looked at the pen in their joined hands, then at him, then at Biscuit, who opened one yellow eye and surveyed the scene with the absolute serenity of a cat who had known how this would end from the very first night. That, Reagan said, can be administratively arranged. She tilted her face up and let him close the distance, and it was still the same as the first time and completely different and exactly right. The indomitable linguist and the reformed king had, between them, rebuilt something from the wreckage of a corrupt empire, clause by careful clause, form by filed form, and one very thoroughly signed non-destruction agreement. And that, darlings, was the most satisfying kind of happily ever after.